So let's look at writing your own functions. Now, the entire point here is that you sort of realise, this piece of code, this little block of code, that's a really useful piece of code. I know that I'm going to be using that over and over again. So I'll turn it into a piece of code that's like in a library, if you like. The way that we do this is we tend to think about three things. You'll need a name for the function, so something that uniquely identifies the function, obviously something that describes what the function does. You have to think about what kind of information will go into the function for it to work, the arguments, so that could be one piece of data or multiple pieces of data. And then you think about what information will come out of the function, what will the returned value be. Now, the way that we actually define and declare a function uses the reserve word function, and then there's some other bits and pieces there, and then at the end we'll have this reserve word return. So those are the two quite important parts of a function. At the beginning of the function we'll have that reserved word function, and what that does is that sends a very clear signal that we're about to define a function, and then we'll have the name of the function, and then we'll have braces, and those braces wrap up the whole of the function implementation. But the last bit is this keyword return, and what that does is that says which piece of data will we actually be returning out of the function. So to actually declare a function, you write the reserved word function, and then you make up a name for the function, and then you actually think about what data or bits of data, what names will go and be used inside the function, and then down the bottom you'll think about what piece of data will actually be returned out. Now, there's one thing to note here, which is you can pass as many bits of data as you like into a function, but with a function you can only get one value out, and that's quite important. We can't pass back lots of different values. We're just going to pass one value back. Let's have a look at an example. So let's keep it really straightforward. Let's imagine that we want to write a function that's going to multiply. Okay, so I'm going to make up a function called multiply. So this is how I define it. I use the reserved word function, and then I think of a name for my multiply function. Well, let's call it multiply. And then after that, in brackets, I have to write down some names. And what those names are will be the names that are local to this function that will contain the data for this function to do its work. So I'm making up some names. I'm going to make up, I need 2 bits of data to do a multiplication. So I'm just literally making these names up. I'm going to call them number 1 and number 2. And you can see how I put them in brackets and I separate them with a comma. Now, let's think about the actual body of this function. What's it actually going to do? Well, if we want to multiply, what do? Well, we're going to multiply number 1 by number 2, and we're going to put that value somewhere. So I'm going to make up a third variable called result. What's the final thing that this function does? Well, it returns that result back. Now, that's a little function. You can see we're going to pass in 2 values. We're going to get 1 value back. We could write that in a much more optimal form, but I'm just going to write it out in this style for the moment, because I want you to get a feel for how often what we'll do is we'll have a variable inside the function, and that variable will be the one that we pass back out when the function completes. And what we'll do in the body of the function is we'll calculate or we'll do some work to actually create that result. Now, clearly here, I've called mine result. You could call it whatever you like. So, the answer, $the answer, and then what we would have is return $the answer. You can use whatever names you like, and those names are local to this function. So how would we actually then use the multiply function? So let's imagine in the body of our program, we've got num1 and num2. So num1 has a value of 3 and num2 has a value of 10. And what we do is we pass those variables to the function to do its work. So we call the function multiply, and then in brackets, we use those names, num1 and num2. Now, when the function runs, what will happen is the values will be transposed into the function. So num1, which has a value of 3, will become number 1. Num2, which has a value of 10, will become number 2 inside the function. So you can see how 3 and 10 are sort of passed into the function using those temporary local names, number 1 and number 2. And then the maths occurs, and then the result is calculated, and we return the result back. So what will happen is multiply will have the value which is created by multiplying those two numbers together, 3 times 10. And of course we could then print the value out. We don't have to print the value out, and what we could do, we could create a variable and we could store that value, and we could use that in any kind of calculation as you would any other kind of literal number or a variable with a number in it. We could use it like that. Let's look at a different example then. Let's look at, say we had to write a function which would calculate the lowest of two numbers. So let's imagine what you're going to do is we had a function, we're going to pass in two numbers, and what we want the function to do is we want to return back whichever one is the lowest. So let's write our function. I'm going to call the function lowest2, and it's going to take two pieces of data, which here I've called x and y. And again, you can use whatever names you like up here, but the important point is inside the function, those bits of data will have the names x and y for us to do our work with. So x and y will come in and they'll be there two numbers, and it's very straightforward. If x is less than y, then we know that the lowest value is x. Otherwise, we know that the lowest value is y. So that's what the first 5 lines inside the function body do. We simply do a test. If x is less than y, we know that x is the smaller one. Otherwise, we know y is the smaller one. And then we simply return the lowest value, whatever the lowest value is. It's either going to be x or it's going to be the value y. And to call that function, so just go through it again, we're going to create two variables called my_1 and my_2, and they're going to have the values 3 and 10. 3 and 10 are passed into the function, as you can see on the third line where it says lowest2, my_1 and my_2. And so temporarily, x and y would have the values of 3 and 10. And then the inside of the function processes what's going on, and we return the value back. And of course, the lowest number in this instance will be 3, and we could then print that out. We're printing it out here. You could be saving it in a variable. You could be using it for further calculations. Now for the bit which really demonstrates how you can reuse functions, and this is the important point. Imagine we actually had to not calculate the lowest of 2. Imagine we had to calculate the lowest of 3 numbers. Now we could write a huge piece of code, if x is less than y and x is less than z, if y is less than this and this and blah, blah, blah. But the whole point here is functions are promoting the idea of code reuse. So have a look at this definition of lowest 3. And what we're doing here is we're going to reuse the definition of lowest 2. So the lowest value is going to be calculated by using lowest 2 2 times. So have a look at the second line. First thing we'll do is we'll work out which is the lowest of y and z, and then we use that to calculate which is the lowest of x and those, just by calling lowest 2 over and over again. And then we return the value. And this is an elegant demonstration of the whole point of functions, that you really want to be able to reuse code, trying to stop repeating code, repeating code over and over again. So how would we call that? Well, you can see I've got number 1, number 2, number 3. I've given them values, and then we call lowest 3 just like that. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then we just get an answer back, just like that.